Hello, morning. Yeah, welcome to Wake Up to Money on Monday, the 27th of May. Very happy bank holiday to you. Just gone 5 o'clock in the morning. Will Bain with you this morning. And yeah, we're going to talk about electric vehicles now, the electric vehicle industry here in the UK, from manufacturing to the sales of them. On our special programme, we'll be speaking with industry bosses and experts about how the EV market is shaping up and answering some of those key questions. Is the EV slowdown a blip, for example? How do car makers and politicians continue to try and drive sales? How big a threat are Chinese electric vehicles? And how do we tackle range anxiety? All that and plenty more we're going to work through over the next hour here on the programme. Firstly, the chief executive of Peugeot told us that the government should consider bringing back incentives to help customers buy electric vehicles. Sean has been speaking to Linda Jackson about a number of topics, including how to deal with the threat from Chinese electric vehicles and the prospect of fully autonomous cars. Peugeot is part of the giant Stellantis group, which also owns Alfa Romeo, Citroën and Vauxhall. The president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has said Europe is being flooded with cheap electric cars from China. So Sean asked Linda Jackson for her take.
Well, I wouldn't say it's being flooded, but they're arriving. There's no doubt about it. And, I've been in this business a long, long time. And I was here when the Japanese arrived and when the Koreans arrived and now the Chinese arrived. So, yes, they are coming in and they're coming in with very good cars, etc., etc. And that's, to be honest with you, we need to see that as a challenge for ourselves, because as European manufacturers, we can't be complacent. And we really need to, as I say, work on how do we get innovative offers? What's our offer different to the Chinese? How can we offer, of course, a very good after-sales service with all of the dedicated dealers that we've got and the coverage we've got. But of course, they're coming in and they're coming in at very low prices to try and grab market. So we need to challenge them, but we need to see it as an opportunity as well. So it's an interesting times, we could say.
See it as an opportunity, given the playing field that you're on right now. Is it possible for you to match those prices? Do you in the short-term time horizon that are being offered by those Chinese manufacturers, given what may be happening? The European Commission president saying huge state subsidies is flooding the global market with cheaper electric vehicles, keeping prices artificially low. Can you match those prices one day without more being done by those regulators here in the UK and around Europe?
Yes, we can. And that's what we have to do is reduce the cost of manufacturing our cars. And that's what we're working on. We've already made a commitment by, for example, 2030, but we're well on the way. But by 2030, we'll have reduced the costs of our electric vehicles by at least 40%. How do we do that? It's by, for example, we are opening gigafactories in Europe. One is already opened in France, where we're building our own batteries. So less reliance on Chinese manufacturers, because you realize today that a lot of the batteries are coming from China. So how do we bring and reduce, for example, the logistics costs, etc., of our components that go into key components that go into our electric vehicles? How do we do that? And that is one of the ways that we can reduce costs. The other way that we do it, for example, within my company, Peugeot is part of a much bigger group called Stellantis, which has 14 brands, and we have common platforms, which means we have a platform where you build a car, an electric car, onto it, and you share the cost. You can gain efficiencies of scale because you're building a lot more, maybe 6 million cars across a number of platforms. So there are some very important things in investments that are being done by manufacturers, and particularly from us as well, which is about how do we reduce the costs? Because we've got to reduce the costs in order to be in any way competing against the Chinese.
So you may well need to reduce the costs, but that doesn't necessarily mean that will stop regulators imposing higher tariffs higher taxes effectively on some of these car imports from China. Do you think there should be a tariff?
Well, I think we've got to have, let me put it this way, rather than declare I want tariffs or not, I think there needs to be a level playing field. And given the amount of investment that manufacturers are having to put in, European manufacturers are having to put in order to get to electrification strategy, which they have to do, let's be honest, because that is part of the deal with the European Commission, which is if we don't, we have very, very high penalties, which of course we don't want to pay and we will not pay for many reasons, but also for ethic reasons. So I think there needs to be a level playing field. And whether that's tariffs or whatever it may be, then I think that needs to be considered. But, just to give you a number, Stellantis spent will be spending something like 40 billion euros for the investment into the electrification strategy. And I'm sure the other manufacturers in Europe will be doing exactly the same. So I think it needs to be recognized that there is a lot of money investment being put in. And also we're trying to bring our cars to the market at a reasonable price. But you need to have a fair market, don't you? You need to have a level playing field, as they say.
And what does that mean from a UK perspective? We're not in the EU now. So, I use these quotes from the European Commission president, but in the UK, what does a level playing field mean for customers and manufacturers here?
Well, I think a level playing field means that everybody has an ability to at least be able to have a cost base which is decent, which is manageable, which is at a price level. If people are coming in, manufacturers are coming in from outside Europe or outside the UK and bringing in vehicles at very, very, very low prices, we immediately think that's great for the customers. Yes, okay, it is for a certain level. It is, but it will reduce the range because that will mean that certain manufacturers will go out of business because the level of investment is too high. So what does that mean specifically for UK? I think we have factories in the UK, so obviously we're producing vehicles in the UK, which is obviously one of the ways that you can counteract some of that concerns. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's a UK thing or a particular French thing or anything else. It's about Europe, and it's about, do we want to support European manufacturers?
But how does the UK not being in the EU have a role in that? Because you could say it's not about the UK and not about France, but the difference is France is in the EU and they're possibly making these big decisions. What difference does it make, all these years on now, that the UK isn't in the European Union and a part of those decisions that the EU is making?
Well, I mean, I'm not an expert on UK politics, so I'm not going to talk about tariffs or anything of those sort of things. But I mean, I guess it depends, doesn't it? Whatever Europe does, in some extent, UK has to protect itself as well. So I would think there's a real link between what happens in Europe and what happens in the UK. But to be honest with you, I'm not into we should have tariffs or the political nature. I'm more getting back to how can I make that journey for our customers into electric vehicles, because at the end of the day, we can have all these tariffs or whatever it may be, and we should stop the Chinese coming in or whatever. But we also need to recognize that the fundamental reason we're doing it is to save the planet. So at the moment, the only solution we have is electric vehicles. So shouldn't we encourage that? So maybe I would talk more about the fact that we need to be able to encourage customers to be able to buy electric vehicles. And that could be by, as I say, reducing the cost and all those things, but maybe also it's by incentives from the governments across Europe, or including it in the UK, which would also help the electric market to move forward.
We had some incentives a couple of years ago for buying an electric vehicle, and that those grants disappeared. What should happen now then?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there was an incentive in France for a couple of months at the beginning of this year, which was called the social leasing, which was about manufacturers took part, and it was supported by the government. And it was about how you could make electric vehicles far more accessible to people on a very limited income. It was a very, very successful. It was for about 3 months. It was a very, very successful, and it lifted the electric market. Obviously, you can't do that on a continuous basis. It's very expensive for the governments. But what it showed was that if you do put incentives in, if you do try to support both sides, both the manufacturers and the government, that clearly, and it's not rocket science, you can instill and accelerate the market. So I think incentives, whilst they're expensive, is a way of encouraging. On the one side, we've got the manufacturers knowing they've got to sell electric vehicles. And on the other side, you've got no incentives from the government in terms of how we can help customers get into electric vehicles.
So I just wonder then, given what we know now, and just seeing, we get stats every week on the car industry, don't we? Recently, across Europe, electric car registrations down by more than 11% over the last year. And the government's approach to those incentives for customers here in the UK, do you think, is it now fair to say we withdrew those incentives too soon?
Well, Did they? Well, that's a good question, isn't it? And it was reduced and it was taken away a long time ago before really the electric market was really installed. So maybe it would be a good idea. Let me put it this way: maybe it would be a good idea to consider looking at incentives again if we want to really move the market up a little bit. Let me put it that way, as opposed to say they took them away too soon. Maybe it would be a good idea to have a look and see whether they could introduce them again.
Biggest thing our listeners lately have been getting in touch with, whether they own an electric car or not, it's on people's minds one way or another, is the cost of public charging and the difference between home charging and public charging and how that's changed over recent years. Do you think public charging in the UK is too high right now?
It is a fact. I mean, it's not doubting the facts that you can compare the rates. So yes, it probably is a bit too high. I have to be honest with you that when you actually look at the statistics, and certainly from our customers, and it's the first statistics coming from customers that bought electric vehicles in the past 2 years, then almost 60 to 70% of them are actually charging at home. So the wall charger is ultra important, which we offer free for our customers. But I think your point is valid. I think there needs to be, I think there's the other part that goes with that. It's not only about the cost, it's also about all of the numerous apps we have to have in order to be able to charge our vehicles. So I think the simplicity of that particular journey is A, a one-stop shop, and B, yes, we need to find some balance between how we charge the car. But at the end of the day, and I know it's not possible for some part of the population, is that the easiest way and the cheapest way is to charge it at home. And as I say, 60 to 70% of customers currently do charge their vehicles at home.
Do you find yourself sometimes, I'm assuming you drive electric cars from time to time, just having that moment when you're, from a personal perspective, thinking, how on earth is the system like this? And almost getting in touch with exactly who's head of your division at Peugeot saying, this needs to be fixed?
Well, I drive an electric car every day. I do have a home charger, so that's an advantage to me. Of course, I've been on the times when you're getting very, very low in terms of your electricity in your car, and you're thinking, am I going to get to the charging station, and is it actually going to be available? So of course it is. But I think also with that, there comes a bit of a mindset change when you're driving electric vehicles. Gone are the times when in an old petrol or a diesel car is that you would probably leave it into the very last moment to charge. What you really need to think about is you charge it on a more regular basis. And therefore, you don't have this ultra horrendous anxiety, stressful moment where you think you've only got 2% more electricity and are you going to get home? So I think there's also a mindset change. But of course, I drive them every day. And of course, but I hit the same problems. But at the end of the day, the infrastructure, I don't think the manufacturers can solve everything, with all due respect. We can produce the cars, we can try and reduce the cost, the accessibility, the reliability of our cars. I offer an 8-year coverage for our cars now, so that you've got no stress. But I don't think we can also be responsible for the infrastructure across the whole of Europe either.
Changing topic a bit, although some listeners may think, how on earth can you move on to a world of autonomous cars when we're currently in a situation where maybe people are looking away from electric cars a little more than they were before, and still question marks around that infrastructure? How can it be that we hear so much from manufacturers like yourself about a world of autonomous driving on our roads?
Well, I'm slightly more pessimistic about total autonomous driving coming tomorrow. I don't think it's going to happen. And I remember some journalist asking me 5 years ago, when are we going to get autonomous vehicles? And people were saying we were going to get it by 2024. Well, here we are in 2024 and there's nothing here. So, I think, and okay, there are some autonomous vehicles on the road, but there's still problems with ethics. There's still problems with the actual technology. So I think we need to think a bit more about levels of autonomous driving. So, through Peugeot cars, you can have what we call level 3, which is things like, it's safety measures, allowing you not to go over the line. It warns you. It can control the driving experience for certain periods of time. You still have to keep your hands, obviously, on the steering wheel. So I think, we're in a transition period where we're moving from levels of autonomy that are already existing on our cars, and that's great because it's improving the safety of our cars. But honestly, I think full autonomous, where we just sit back, eyes off, hands off, feet off, head off, or whatever it may be, I think they're a long, long, long way away. And the other reason I think they're a long way away is that it's a very, very expensive technology.
Do you think it's a
I'm not sure-
distraction, given what it seems the car industry and governments are trying to achieve with persuading people to get electric cars? Is it a distraction that so much focus, maybe so much money, is put on autonomous driving?
I think, as I say, the level of investment that we need to put on for improving the safety, I think is true. But actually, this idea that we can just sit back and not drive the car and it just drives for us, I have to be honest with you, I think is in the future. And I think we should just concentrate right now on some of the things, the investment that we're having to do, which of course is about electric, as we've just been discussing. So, I think there'll be lots of technology which is safety driven, and I think that's absolutely right. There's lots of technology that we're introducing, which will be about how do we improve the driving experience. So we're going to move away from a round steering wheel to a steering control column. Why not? That's what we're going to do in a couple of years. But honestly, I think we're going to, even if we have an interview like this in 5 years' time, I still don't think we're going to have autonomous vehicles that you and I are driving.
I'll probably still ask you about it though in 5 years, Linda. Can I ask you, are we allowed to talk about combustion engines and how much people love their petrol and diesel cars? I just wonder, would Peugeot now, when you see the way customers are reacting and maybe not hanging around for infrastructure changes in electric and going, I'm going to buy another petrol car, actually. I thought my next one would be electric, but I'm going to go petrol or diesel. Do you start to increase a proportion of your marketing budget again towards petrol and diesel? Because all the ads we see are electric.
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest. We're in a fortunate position at Peugeot, part of the Stellantis group, because our platforms can be what we call multi-energy. So I can, for example, a new vehicle that I'm launching right now, which is called the 3008, is available in electric. And I told you it was a big range, 680. But you can also have that in a hybrid version. So if you like, we're trying, which is a thermic type one.
And can you get it in full petrol, full diesel as well?
You're not going to get it in diesel. No, you're not going to get it in diesel.
You can get full petrol. So does it almost, your ad that may have an E in the front of it on whatever we see in the cinema screens or on TV, is that actually doing a bit of a marketing job for the petrol car itself as well?
Absolutely. I mean, that's what's being super efficient, cost efficient on the marketing, which is you obviously advertise a 3008, but and it's electric. But of course, customers come in, they go onto the websites, they'll go into our dealerships. And of course, they'll be able to, as I say, have a hybrid version or a plug-in hybrid version as well of that vehicle. So it brings people in and then people can choose. We are in a period of transition, let's be honest. And whilst we want to persuade people to move from a petrol or a diesel into an full electric, we also provide the ability for them to move into a hybrid version or a plug-in hybrid version, which, if you like, is on the journey towards.
Linda Jackson, the boss of Peugeot, speaking to Sean there. Well, engineering needs to be thought of as the new rock and roll. That's what Peter Rawlinson told me. He's the British chief executive of Lucid, an electric vehicle manufacturer based in Silicon Valley in California. He's been with the company for 11 years, having previously had a pretty good track record in electric vehicles as chief vehicle engineer at Tesla. Lucid started life as a high-end manufacturer, but Peter Rawlinson is on a mission to make it a mass-market car, and he wants to produce 1 million vehicles a year by 2030. He started off by explaining how Lucid began.
I've been with the company for 11 years, joined a tiny battery company and really turned it into Lucid Motors, co-founded Lucid Motors with a clear vision to develop the most advanced technology in the world so that we can advance the electric car to accelerate man's transition to sustainable mobility, and to do that through high technology. And we see that high-tech solution being the answer to some of the fundamental barriers to widespread adoption of the EV, namely range anxiety and cost of access and ownership.
Here's a simple one for people who, or perhaps not a so simple one, for people listening on their podcast or on the radio. Describe some of your cars. What do they look like?
We currently have the Lucid Air in widespread production, and that's available in the US from $69,900. It's the longest range pure battery electric vehicle on the market today. We have a variant which has got over 500 miles range. We also have a high-performance variant, which does 0 to 60 in 1.89 seconds.
And for non-petrol heads, put that in context against, I don't know, a petrol car?
Well, a very fast petrol engine car do 0 to 60 in about 3 seconds. That would be pretty high performance. Yeah.
Why did you want to get into this sector? Tell people a little bit about your background and why you came to this in your career.
Well, I'm an engineer. I've always engineered cars. It's been a passion of mine. I was with Jaguar Cars in Coventry for many years. And later in my career, I was at Lotus. I was chief engineer of advanced engineering. And then I was asked to join a fledgling US company called Tesla. I was chief engineer for Tesla Model S and Model X. And then really set up Lucid to take the technology to a whole new level. And that's why Lucid exists.
I was going to say, what did you see as, I guess, the opportunity or the thing that maybe not necessarily that Tesla wasn't doing, but that you thought wasn't there in the market that needed doing with Lucid?
Well, I mean, I really, value my time at Tesla. I was there for 3 years from 2009 through to 2012. And at that stage, Tesla was truly at the cutting edge, developing the most advanced technology with a clarity of vision and purpose and an absolute singularity of mindset. And what I'm seeing now is I'm seeing worrying trend towards sort of distraction. Tesla seems to be distracted. There's an interest in social media, even politics, and it's kind of losing its way. I don't see it having that singular sense of purpose. And I think it really falls to Lucid to take the technology to a whole new level now.
I'm interested in well, you tell me whether it's a choice or whether it's a necessity. Interested in the route that you've gone, going high end first and coming down the scale in terms of affordability for customers. One of the arguments that people have made about the success of BYD, for example, the Chinese competitor, is that they kind of went the other way around. They got the kind of mass market model out there first, and now they're turning to the high end luxury vehicles. Was it a conscious choice? And if so, why did you choose to go that way around?
It's a well-trodden path for a technology company. You start with a high-end product, you attract early adopters, and then you gradually grow your market. There's another reason, just pure finances. Paradoxically, the cost of industrializing many products is inversely proportional to the cost of the product. So Rolls-Royce is a crazy expensive product, but because of that, you don't sell many. So the factory is set up, doesn't cost much. If you're going to do a Volkswagen Golf, it's all about numbers. The factory costs zillions, but the car's affordable. So clearly, as a startup, we had to attract initial investment. It wasn't on to go for a mass market. Now, if you look at BYD, it's a completely inverted economics there, because you've got an industry which is heavily subsidized by Chinese government. So you've got a very skewed set of economics, very different environment. For us, we wanted to start high. It enables us to develop the core technology, the cutting edge technology. We've got the most advanced car in the world in production right now. As a result, we're outselling Porsche Taycan, Mercedes EQS today in the US because people are growing in their awareness of our technology. And also, it establishes a brand. You start high up and you come down. It's awfully difficult to establish a brand low down and push it up. It took Audi, 20, 30 years to do this.
It's got to be cool first.
Totally.
We've come to China already, so let's stay there, right?
All right?
It's one of the talking points, right, in the whole market. We know that in Europe, in the UK and the European Union, for example, looking at perhaps restrictions on Chinese vehicles here, the United States looking at what they might be able to do to protect kind of nascent industry there. In the way the playing field is currently set up, can companies like Lucid or a European startup possibly compete with the BYDs?
Well, it depends which place in which market, because it's not a level playing field. You've got labour rates which are artificially low, and then you've got heavily supported government incentives for a company like BYD. So it's just not a level playing field. Interesting observation, though. I think the Chinese car industry has advanced immeasurably over just the last 3 or 4 years. Their inherent ability to design, develop and manufacture cars, particularly the body engineering, fit and finish, quality of interior, door fit, wind noise, things like that, even to a lesser degree vehicle dynamics, has improved immeasurably. I still think they're many years behind on the core EV technology, but I've no doubt they'll get there.
Carlos Tavares and others at Stellantis, for example, have basically said Chinese vehicles, if we don't do something political, they'll just crush all of our industry in Europe, in North America, that we won't be able to compete at all, that we will only be buying Chinese EVs. I mean, do you see it as black and white as that? Do you want action?
I don't. I think I believe in free market economics. I believe that this is a technology race which is yet to play out. Lucid is at the forefront of that. We are many years ahead of even Tesla in terms of our core powertrain technology, which means we can go further with less battery than anyone, including the Chinese, which means we can make an EV with less battery, and the battery is the big ticket item in the cost of an EV. And this is a race which is not run yet, and the gap is growing. The gap is not closing with us. Our tech roadmap is advancing faster than the other runners are catching us.
So you would fight on kind of performance and price?
Absolutely. And also I think on just brand positioning as well.
It often feels like the governments, the regulators, the infrastructure side of it is not actually keeping, you talked about this race earlier, not actually keeping up with the pace of you guys, the technologists, the guys making this product.
Yes.
Do you feel that? And is that a frustration?
Yes. It's not really, because there is a historical precedent here, Will, that if you look 100 years ago when the petrol car was in its infancy, I know that my great-grandfather, who ran a Buick in South Wales, there wasn't a petrol station. He went to the chemist shop and got some spirit, a demijohn, a glass demijohn of spirit to pour in his Buick.
This is definitely a don't try this at home.
No, don't try. I strongly recommend you don't. But what happened was that the infrastructure of petrol stations followed the emergence and rapid growth of the petrol engine car. And I think that's only natural. I think if we force an infrastructure first, I think that is putting the cart before the horse. I really do.
The other race that's on at the moment in this sector is about resources, the minerals, the metals that go into the battery, the products.
Yes.
And also, again, it becomes political again, doesn't it? Where those come from, where those supply chains are, how those supply chains work.
Indeed.
That feels about as knotted up as it's ever been right now. How, I guess, how slowing, debilitating could that be on the take-up of this industry?
Look, no one can solve all of these problems. It's an absolute multidimensional puzzle. What we can do is to provide the best engineered vehicles with the best technology. But I've got to say this, as an engineer, usually my world is full of horrible, horrible compromises. And I'm afraid there's all roads lead to one thing. Efficiency makes everything better. Because if you've got a more efficient car and you can go further with less electricity, you can go further with less batteries. And therefore, you use less mined minerals, less lithium, less nickel, less cobalt. So let's really progress the electric car to a level where we can produce more cars with less mines and less raw minerals. That's my task.
That sounds like at the moment, though, that we need to work with China more than we are in Europe and the United States, for example, at the moment. Share more than we have been.
Well, this affects every human being on the planet. Truly does.
Costs for companies involved in this rather than consumers this time. Your financial results, you've had your financial results out in the week that we're having this chat. Big improvement, but still a big loss, a significant loss. Yeah. How, I guess, because we want lots of Lucids, right? If this is going to be successful, we need lots of Lucids to come forward and come through and break through. Do you think that's possible? Is that possible in the current kind of financial framework that we have? Can you get to profitability quickly enough, I suppose, to appease investors, to make that work, to get the number of companies that we do need to make this transition successful?
We have a long-term road to profitability. It's all about scale. Our finances are dominated by our long-term investments for the future. We've put massive investment into our state-of-the-art purpose-built factory in Arizona, the first purpose-built EV factory in North America. We're currently pouring concrete for the footings for our purpose-built factory in Saudi Arabia. We've already got the first Saudi Arabian car factory up and running. It's running as we speak, and we're putting in 150,000 unit capacity ready for late 26. So we've got finances which are dominated by long-term investments for the future. And we've also got to amortize the depreciation of those facilities against the volume of cars we're currently producing. So we need scale. It's all about growing scale through awareness.
And without trying to continuously drag us back to politics, but it does matter, of course, because we've seen how, say, as we've talked about already, governments' views towards working with China or working with Russia or working with a number of other countries have changed in mine or your working lifetimes drastically. You're working very closely with Saudi Arabia and the private investment fund there. I guess what's your level of nervousness that geopolitics overtakes things that you are completely out of your control? Geopolitics overtakes things and starts to influence economics and your ability to do business.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex landscape and it's impossible to plan truly for every eventuality. But you have to sort of take a chess-playing view of this and mitigate risk as best as you reasonably can and foresee likely moves on that chessboard within a reasonable timescale. That's all we can do.
Let's come back to and round out talking product again, because as you said it right at the start, it's the key thing in all of this, isn't it? People have got to want to drive these things. And in your time at Tesla, we were just chatting about this before we set the mics live. Tesla was cool. I mean, I used to say this on the World Service when I started doing this job. Tesla didn't have investors. It had fans. It had supporters, people who were as passionate about it as they are about football clubs or their favourite singers. That, and not just because of that particular company, but they were the flag bearer, that seems to have gone awry somewhere down the track, doesn't it? People don't seem to have that passion and that excitement, perhaps, for the product in the same way again. How do you regrip that? What is the key to regaining that again?
Well, I think it is very concerning, and as I say, I think there's a clear distraction there from the leadership, which perhaps doesn't best serve those who are looking for an electric future. And I think that people rally to a sense of mission. Lucid has that mission.
But can it be dangerous in a time where we've seen it that's got so political? You know, people really celebrate. Ford made this electric F-150, right? The best-selling truck on the planet. And people almost celebrated going back to the petrol one again, that they were making a statement, that they were making a point, you know, they're putting it on their social media again. There's been that sort of weird fight back, weird sort of pushback, hasn't there, around the world? And I just wonder how you counter that.
Well, I as I say, I think that there needs to be greater recognition that Lucid isn't here just to be a niche luxury player. That's not what we're about. We're developing the most advanced technology with a sense of absolute mission to benefit the whole world and everyone on this planet. And this needs to happen rapidly. And I am confident there will be many, many people who will rally to that sense of mission, that sense of purpose, where we carry the mantle forward.
What's your dream? When are we going to see a right-hand drive for here in the UK going down past where your dad was bringing that Buick in South Wales, say? What do you think?
Well, we know the market for it is huge in Wales, of course, so we need to pander for that. But my dream is that I would like to see Lucid make 1 million cars a year. I know it sounds crazy. Early 30s, I think it's reasonable. I mean, we're seeing a growth 40% quarter on quarter the last quarter one this year versus last year, 37% growth in deliveries year on year. We need to continue on that exponent, bring in our mid-sized platform and have a meaningful impact. And also through supplying our technology, we're supplying to Aston Martin. We have a contract to electrify Aston Martin for the next 10 years. They're going to use our Sapphire technology to power their hypercars. Announced that deal last year. Love to do some more licensing deals with other automakers. We've got to have a substantial impact on helping this planet.
I'm very lucky I get to talk to a lot of people in your role a lot. You don't just sound across it and that you're interested in it. You sound like you love this.
Well, this isn't a job for me. This is a mission. I don't have a normal job. We've been through hell to get the company to this stage. We faced untold trials and tribulations for many years. It was only in 2018, early 19, we got the financing from the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia, which really rescued us. And they had the foresight to invest in us. They saw the technological advantage. And that's what we've got, and that's what differentiates us. We've got the tech, and we've got the Public Investment Fund as absolute partners.
Skills, training people, education for people to work in this sector.
Totally.
A lot of talk about, all around the world, right, about how we transition people to be ready for these skills of the future. Do you see anywhere that's doing it well? And what for you in the industry is kind of best practice for getting the people we need, the people you would need at Lucid to make those million cars?
Okay. So I passionately believe that a company is only as good as the collective intellect in that company. The whole notion that other companies have got more experience is completely invalid. When I joined Tesla, I had the luxury of handpicking my engineering team. We had the best engineering team in the world, and that's how we created the Tesla Model S. That's how it happened. And we had a very small team of brilliant engineers. And we've done the same thing at Lucid. It's all about attracting the best brains in the world. And one brilliant engineer will do the work of not 10, but 100 normal people. But I want to cover something else as well. Why is this happening in Silicon Valley? And I really think that we, particularly in Great Britain, we need to make engineering more aspirational and on the STEM subjects. England and Great Britain has produced some of the greatest engineering talent, even on the world stage today. A lot of my engineers are from the UK. It's surprising, and on the Model S team, it was the same. And I think that engineering is still not sexy enough here in the UK. But if you go to Silicon Valley, as an engineer, you're the top dog. It's very interesting cultural difference.
Where do you think we're going wrong? And what would you do, or what would you advise someone to do to try and shift that?
I think that engineering needs to be positioned as the new rock and roll, because this is what's going to save the planet. This is a call to arms for scientists, mathematicians, programmers, all types of creative to rally to this mission. I really do.
And that starts in schools.
So it starts in schools, and it starts with an aspiration, an ambition that they want to do something and making things. How cool is that?
And does it need government push to that? Does it need incentives, I guess, here in the UK, for example, to do that, to catch up?
I think it needs perhaps a little mindset change from not just the government, but also the media, and how the media portrays these vital skill sets. I think people like yourself could play a hugely significant role, Will.
Go on. Do you want to say how?
I think the way the media portrays the value of engineering and science, and that has a direct bearing upon the aspirations of the next generation.
Peter Rawlinson there, the boss of the electric vehicle startup Lucid. So, we've heard plenty from some of the manufacturers, those hoping to sell us those vehicles, but what about the retailers who are going to be on the front line of doing just that? Sean spoke to Robert Forrester of Lucid Motors, one of the UK's biggest dealership networks.
The government moved the ban, if you remember, from 2030 to 2035. 2035, no petrol or diesel new car sales, but didn't move the very vicious, really fining structures that have been put in place from this year to 2030. So by this year's 22% of cars have to be battery electric vehicles, 2030, 80%. And the policy just isn't joined up. And these manufacturers are facing fines of £15,000 a car, which is an extraordinary amount of money per car. The impact on the UK economy will clearly be negative. If the UK economy is producing less petrol and diesel cars for the market in the UK, then clearly there is going to be, quite significant reduction in economic activity.
Is that not part of the point of the target, though, that there may be a price to pay, but it's psychologically moving us away from combustion engine cars and eventually will get us to actually all owning electric vehicles?
Well, I think everybody can buy into the concept of cleaning up the environment, but at the end of the day, we have to have an economy and we have to have jobs. And the automotive sector is a very significant part of the UK economy, employing hundreds of thousands of people, as well as the retail sector employing 500,000 people. So I think the government just has to get its act together and get joined up. We're not arguing that the government shouldn't be acting on these issues. What we're arguing is that it doesn't actually make any sense to have a ban in 2035, but to have these massive fines in the near term.
I wonder what impact you think it might have on new vehicles you get at Vertu, and particularly ones that are made in the UK, the UK car manufacturing industry.
Yeah, I mean, we sell cars that are made in the UK. We sell cars from China, Japan, and Europe. I actually think the key issue is going to be when consumers potentially come into dealerships in the next 12 to 18 months and can't buy a petrol car that they actually want to buy. And I think that's going to be quite a moment, actually. And let's face it, it's 10 years before the ban. I think that's the major problem. It's the speed at which these fines have come in.
Robert, thank you. Robert Forrester there, Vertu Motors Chief Executive.
We're here to shine a bit more light on all of what we've been hearing. It's Professor David Bailey. He's a motoring expert and the Professor of Business and Economics at Birmingham Business School. David, really interesting, wasn't it? You know, Sean's interview there with Linda Jackson for Peugeot, my interview with Lucid. One absolutely brand new in this space, a startup, another a company that most of our listeners will have heard of, a brand most of our listeners would have heard of. And yet, did you sense some sort of similarities in the challenges they're facing and how they see themselves sort of trying to tackle those, I suppose?
Yes, very much so. I think there were some common themes across the two. One, obviously, is the need to get cost down in terms of batteries and electric vehicles in order to get into the mass market and to be able to compete with the Chinese players that are coming. So that's a major challenge for both of them. They also talked about charging infrastructure, although in the case of Linda, she saw it as a kind of constraint on take-up, whereas in the case of Peter, he thought it would come naturally. I think there needs to be a much greater effort on putting in the charging infrastructure to encourage people to switch over. But they also talked about the need for a level playing field, or the fact that the playing field isn't level between Western makers and China, where in China there's massive state support for the sector. That has been going on for a long time. It's helped Chinese firms get their costs down and has put them in a very competitive position regarding the West.
Let's start there then as well. Let's stay with the kind of the big geopolitics, if you like, and perhaps we'll come to the things that we control a little bit more here in the UK later, because Linda's big boss, Carlos Tavares, the boss of Stellantis, the group that Peugeot is part of now, has been probably one of the most strident, hasn't he, and one of the most outspoken about, as he sees it, the threat Chinese electric vehicles from the likes of Great Wall and BYD are to companies like his getting products off the ground and manufacturing in Europe and in the UK. Is he right to have the kind of fears that he holds, I suppose, in the intensity that he holds them?
Yes, no, I would very much agree with him on that. In fact, I've been saying for a very long time that unless the European car industry moves quickly into adopting EVs, then it risks being wiped out by the new Chinese players that are coming in. And so essentially China's been at this for 25 years, huge state support. They've also built a battery industry, control over the raw materials. They're able to make electric vehicles at something like 40%, 30 to 40% lower cost than in the European Union and in the US. We're seeing a wave of Chinese cars now arriving into ports in Europe. In fact, ports in Europe being clogged up with so many Chinese cars coming. So his basic point is that, unless Europe moves more quickly, including some sort of support, there is a very real danger to the European car industry. And I would agree with that.
In terms of take-up, though, the ultimate goal, right, from governments, let's stick in Europe as well, the UK and Europe, is to get more of us out of petrol, diesel cars and into electric vehicles. If Chinese manufacturers can do that at a price that's much more competitive and that people are willing to pay for models that they choose to drive, isn't that ultimately good news towards the overall goal?
Yes, very much so. In fact, there's a real sort of fundamental policy dilemma in Europe and in the UK, in the sense that on the one hand, we want to get to net zero by 2050. That means decarbonising transport. That means getting people into electric cars. We need cheaper electric cars to do that. So if Chinese electric cars are cheap, we can switch people over more quickly and encourage the transition. Equally, European and British policymakers want to preserve the automotive industry. That might require some protection from this Chinese competition in the short to medium term to allow it time to catch up. So there's a fundamental tension, I think, for policymakers, and there's a big question for them about whether they put in place tariffs, how high they should be, but also more generally about how we encourage a transition to electric vehicles.
Well, I was going to ask you exactly that. Expand on that a bit. What type of things do you think we should be doing here in the UK, or at least thinking about here in the UK, beyond tariffs, as you say, which seem like the sort of the first instrument?
So I think policy in the UK has been fundamentally confused. Obviously, the messing about with the targets 2040, then 2030, 2035, that has essentially meant some people have decided, I don't need to go electric yet, I can put it off. So that's been very unhelpful. The mandate that the government has introduced is also, I think, problematic for domestic producers, because essentially this year they've got to sell 22% of their cars as zero emission, rising to 80% by 2030. If they don't hit that, they face fines. The pure play Chinese firms coming in don't face that, so we're effectively penalising our own industry. We have to, I think, be doing much more in terms of charging infrastructure. I've been driving an electric car for 10 years, and initially it was very easy to charge because nobody else had one. Now I'm often competing, as it were, with lots of other people to charge my car, and I have to plan ahead much more carefully. I think the other big problem is that I can charge my car at home overnight on a domestic tariff for 7p a kilowatt hour. If I go to a fast charger, a public charger, I could be paying 10 times that. And part of what is driving that is higher VAT on public chargers than at home. So the government, I think, could do more in terms of some sort of incentives to buy electric cars. They scrapped those too early, and thinking about tax rates to try and reduce the tax on public charging.
That's really interesting. So that we should have some of those sort of, whether it be a tax break or a cash incentive for people to try and buy these products again, reintroduce that.
Yes, I think the government took that out too early because electric car prices are still above internal combustion engine cars in Europe. Not so much in China. In fact, in many cases, they're cheaper. But here, the upfront cost is higher. The government withdrew the subsidies last year, I think, far too early. That means the upfront cost puts people off buying. So we could look again at incentives. That was something Linda was talking about. In the case of the SMMT, the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders, they're suggesting a temporary VAT cut for electric car buys. That may be another way to go. I think what we've seen in terms of policy support in the UK is lots of sort of tax breaks around company cars and salary sacrifice. That basically means that if you're in a good job and you can get a company car, it's a no-brainer to go electric. And that's what's really still driving growth in electric cars. But for private buyers, demand is essentially stalled because of these issues. So we've got to look at how we can incentivize private buyers to get into electric cars.
Yeah, it's certainly been the type of thing we've heard. Certainly been the type of thing we've heard from the likes of Bristol Street Motors when they've come on the program and talked about exactly that in terms of what they're seeing in sales, not so much to private, plenty to these sort of fleets, these company fleets as well. In terms of the charging side of it, David, who should be putting the kind of, because it needs financial oomph as well as planning, right? Who is not putting their shoulder to the wheel, so to speak, in terms of that financial oomph? We sort of seem to see everybody pointing their finger at everybody else. The government points at local government points at companies point at the energy companies, car companies point at local governments. It seems to sort of go round and round and round. Who should be driving that forward?
So it goes round and round and round because it's a complicated problem. And there's all sorts of issues about planning, about getting the energy supply to the places where it's needed for charging points. Local governments have a lot of knowledge about where charging points should be because they understand their local area, but they've in many cases simply run out of cash. The energy companies want to do things and their investors sort of looking at the investment opportunities. But I think the government have got to really get a grip of this in terms of really rolling out the infrastructure, supporting local governments in doing that, thinking about a better financial package to get the infrastructure in place more quickly. There's a real danger, I think, that we get to 2035 and actually we're not in good enough shape to be able to charge all of the electric cars that are coming, because the direction of travel is clear. We are going electric. There are questions about how quick that is, but the government's date is now 2035. We have to have the infrastructure in place by then to make it happen.
Do you think the government has been committed enough to kind of, I guess, the education, the PR that's needed to bring people along on that journey? We see scare stories flare up about electric cars, that they're more combustible, that they'll burn longer, that that they weigh too much. All of these different sort of scare stories that never seem to be sort of snuffed out. That the narrative is allowed to linger out there and hang out there, and that sort of seeps into people's sort of general distrust of this tech.
I certainly think there's been an effort, as it were, by certain parts of the media, not the BBC, but certain news outlets, which have really had a go at electric cars. It's quite a hostile media environment, I think, because any story about electric cars is kind of exaggerated quite often. I mean, take the case of, the fires. They are less likely, if anything, than internal combustion engine to catch fire. And yet that seems to have got hold in certain parts of the media. So that there needs to be much more of an effort, I think, by the car makers, but also the government, if they want to encourage us to switch over, to actually, as you put, snuff those stories out very quickly, because that will affect confidence and it will affect people's willingness to make the switch. So much clearer messaging about the benefits of electric cars, not only in terms of the environment, but how actually useful they are and the cost savings that can be made if you can charge at home. So some much clearer messaging, I think, would be useful.
As we head towards an election, is that something that worries you, that this has become a culture war issue, basically, hasn't it? It's become a political football.
Yes, it has. And I mean, I think the reason why the government pushed back the target from 2030 to 2035 was because they thought there were votes in it. And essentially they kind of are now saying, well, you've got longer to make your mind up as consumers. So they're not forcing us into electric cars, as it were, but equally they're applying a lot of pressure to the manufacturers through these mandate targets, which ramp up way too quickly. So it's all kind of stick now and no carrots. And that's why I think we need to be giving more carrots, incentives for people to get into electric cars.
And I guess could part of that be driving more investment in the manufacturing of them or the parts for them here in the UK too? We kind of know, don't we, historically, that people often feel extremely proud of a product if it's built near them. You think of Mini in Oxford and Rover back in the day, where both you and I are from. That people really, bought into those brands and those ideas because of that. Could the government put more effort into, and it's made a lot of effort, hasn't it, to try and secure more jobs in this sector? But where are we, I suppose, as a country in terms of having those skills to take that on and be more self-sufficient in this area?
I think that's a very good point. I'm not sure a Buy British campaign would work very well because of recollections of the 1970s, for example. But I certainly think the government needs to be doing much more in terms of an industrial strategy to support the building out of a supply chain in the UK. We've been lagging behind. There have been two or three big announcements in terms of Envision in the northeast and Tata in terms of making batteries at scale. That's hugely important. The government does now finally have a battery strategy. That is very good as well. But the size of support on offer in the UK is dwarfed by what is happening in the US in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, the EU's sort of Green New Industrial Policy, and what's taking place in China. So there's a real danger that we're kind of left sitting on the sidelines watching all the action unfold elsewhere. And the reason why this is so important is that making batteries in the UK is critical to the future of keeping an auto industry here. If we have to import the batteries, That adds to cost significantly because they're heavy, and it makes the UK industry vulnerable to being moved elsewhere.
And it's a point Peter Rawlinson from Lucid really stressed, didn't he? You know, that he grew up working for Jaguar here. He's from the Midlands originally himself, and yet he spent most of his career working for big American companies in Silicon Valley. And he was sort of almost dismayed, really, in his chat with me, wasn't he? That, you know, we produce plenty of people out of our universities who are interested in this stuff, who are talented in doing this stuff, and yet there's nowhere for them to go, or they don't feel like there's work for them here in the UK.
Yes, he kind of almost lamented that, didn't he, in what he was saying. I think there's a number of interesting things there. One is, of course, Silicon Valley is where a lot of the action is taking place because essentially a lot of electric cars are now largely software dominated. So that's why car makers and engineers have gone there. We could be doing a lot more in this space, I think, in terms of taking the brilliant research done in our universities, where a lot of really important research and development is being done on things like batteries, and encouraging that to be sort of commercialized in the UK. There are various catapults in the UK. That's one of the good parts of government policy to try and make that happen. We could be doing much more of that. But I think that his broader point about the sort of the value of engineering and manufacturing is very well made. I think we neglect that at our peril in the UK. And I think one of the reasons why our productivity performance in the UK isn't so good is that we haven't had a bigger and more successful engineering and manufacturing base.
Professor David Bailey there from Birmingham Business School, bringing us just about to the end of this edition of Wake Up to Money. Thanks so much for listening.